Sheila, Lisa, and Natalia to Breast Cancer Conversations. It is my pleasure to be speaking with all of you today, and we have such an exciting conversation lined up for us, one specifically on metastatic breast cancer, and then also highlighting the amazing work that you guys have done individually and coming together as a community for the newest and latest and greatest podcast, our MBC Life. So for all of you listening today, we are going to take some deep dives into some questions and really get to know our panelists, their stories. And I'm, like we do every single week, going to dive into some deeper questions and kind of see how we can educate our listeners and our community members, both early stage and those with more advanced stage breast cancer. So welcome to all of you. I'd like to kind of start off before we go too far into the conversation and maybe quickly around the room. What type of language should we be using in today's conversation? I know everyone has different preferences, whether they gravitate towards survivor or thriver, cancer haver, living with MBC, etc. So Sheila, if we can start with you, I feel like this also goes with like, how do you identify, if we want to throw in like gender and everything else in there today too. What type of language should we use when discussing breast cancer in your story?
I would say for me, living with MBC.
Yeah.
Survivor, thriver. Language doesn't bother me.
Oh, excellent. Lisa, what about for you?
I also like to identify as a woman living with MBC. I use the she, her, pronouns, but living sums it up, because for me, life can be the good, the bad, the ugly, the amazing, the challenging. And I think that sums up life before MBC for me and after.
Yeah, absolutely. And Natalia, what are your preferences?
Well, my pronouns are she, her. I don't have a preference. Living with or thriver is usually, I guess, most identifiable, but I'm
Excellent.
open.
I know when I'm talking to a group or a panel of anyone, I say, sometimes I use the word survivor, sometimes thriver, but that doesn't mean we have to be thriving all the time. Like, I never mean to be offensive. And there's just sometimes when you're speaking to an audience and you never know who's listening, just trying to clear the air that we are here to just have great conversations and educate people, and that nothing that we say is meant to ever be offensive. And there we go. So welcome. I'm so excited to chat with all of you guys today. And, as we shine light on metastatic breast cancer, I think this is something I feel, and feel free to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like for the longest time, it hasn't been at the forefront of conversations. And I remember in 2019, this is pre-COVID, I was at the San Antonio Breast Cancer Symposium. And I feel like for the first time, it was actually being talked about a lot more at a lot of the poster sessions and some of the research and studies that were being presented. And there started to be the shift where from the medical industry and the research that stage 4 and metastatic breast cancer was starting to have more attention provided to it. And I'm also noticing that also in the podcast world, in the newsletters, and what nonprofits are doing, and different organizations around really trying to empower patient advocacy, knowledge, support, and kind of thinking if we can help and solve this problem at the top where there is no cure for metastatic disease, the benefits are going to start to trickle down and help everybody else from early stage going down even to preventative and risk reducing strategies. So would you agree with that? Or how are you feeling in 2021 about where MBC is today? Natalia, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure. I think people are more open to hearing about MBC stories. And I think medically speaking, or through research, kind of trying to find a way to live with MBC instead of passing it on to early stage people living with early stage breast cancer. But I do think that it's been not easy to have conversation about MBC and bringing it to life. I think even before, when I was an early stager, you have the assumption that living with metastatic disease kind of feels like you're at the end of your rope. And so there's not a lot of emphasis on that because it's almost as if you're past the time to help. Now it's the time to grieve almost. But I think learning about, even myself being in a community with other MBC people kind of opens up this idea that there are so many people living with MBC, and there are so many people who have lots of stories to share and to tell about thriving and living with MBC at the same time. So it's been, over the last 4 years, it's been really surprising. I think COVID kind of also highlighted that, you know, we're also out here, because I think a lot of the, sorry, I have the worst chemo grip brain, but a lot of the, a lot of the summits and get-togethers that you have for breast cancer really focuses on early stage disease. And so there wasn't an opening, but I think COVID did something where it kind of allowed these niches to come about and allow you to find a place where you can kind of hang your hat in and be part of a community and MBC was one of that for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I feel that also with social media, people are posting and tagging a lot more about it. So it's easier to find people who are diagnosed with MBC and connecting with them and starting relationships, as well as people are living longer than they used to, right? So, you know, that's another thing in terms of just watching the progression of science and medicine and people getting involved and having more conversations about how to get involved in clinical trials and access to care and medicine is really actually starting to benefit you. I was really impressed actually with some of your podcasts that I know we'll talk about in a little bit. So spoiler alert for those listening, but the unicorns in the metastatic community, right? The people who are living beyond the odds and going beyond the stats, and really we still don't really know why. I always just tell people, hug me, rub off on me, and, you know, just keep living our best life possible. But, you know, I think a lot of these things are coming together in culmination, which are now allowing us to say, okay, like we need to really pay attention to this.
I think there's also another generation of people with MBC out there that are more comfortable sharing their lives and that they have MBC. So I think social plays a huge part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel like I jumped the gun here just going into my quick questions, and we didn't really do much of an introduction. So if we can start, maybe Sheila, if you want to give a little introduction about who you are, where you're calling from, and a little bit about your background with breast cancer.
Hi, my name is Sheila McGlown, and I live in Illinois. I'm about 12 miles from the Missouri border. About 4 hours from Chicago. I am a 25-year Air Force veteran, and I found out I had metastatic breast cancer while I was active duty. My mom was diagnosed in 2001. 2004, she died of metastatic breast cancer. That had spread to her lungs, and then I didn't know metastatic meant stage 4. 5 years later, I received the diagnosis, and I felt a sneeze, and the sneeze was the cancer rubbing up on my ribs.
Oh, wow.
So I had to retire from the military, and that's when I said that I was going to better understand the disease, because I didn't know Black women got breast cancer, because Black women don't talk about being sick. We just don't talk about being sick in our culture. And when it happened, I'm going to do what I can that my daughter never, or anybody's daughter's son, never has to worry about this disease. So that's why I advocate for metastatic breast cancer. I think we have strong, resilient advocates out that are passionate, even though they're facing this disease. They put disease behind them, and they want people to know that, you know, they want to help. You know, they want more research. So that's who I am, and thank you for having me.
So you mentioned that your mother had breast cancer. Was that something that you were aware of when she was diagnosed? I know we mentioned a lot of times we keep this stuff close to our vest. We don't talk about it. And we also want to be strong for our family and our children. Was that something that you and her spoke about while she was going through her cancer diagnosis?
No, because I was in the military. I was in Okinawa, Japan. September 11th happened. I get a call maybe a day or two. Mom has breast cancer. I'm like, what? Lumpectomy. Well, what's the lumpectomy? Chemo. I thought you get chemo, you fixed.
Right.
But, you know, 3 years later, that spread to her lungs. And I found out, I was talking to my mom. She forgot my birthday. And I was like, my mom never forgets my birthday. August 17th. I went home July 31st because I was in Virginia. August 17th, she passed.
Mm.
So I don't know whether I blame. I thought you walk the walk, you walk a Coleman walk or whatever. I did my diligence, for breast cancer. But soon did I find out there's more to it than that. So
they make it look easy with the pink boas and all these women taking over the streets and walking. I'm completely there with you. It's overwhelming because you don't know the language. I remember one of my friends when she got diagnosed before me, which I also kind of think was an interesting omen that she got diagnosed and then I got diagnosed a year later. But she was like, "Oh, I'm getting a mastectomy," and I had to go home and Google these words. I know I heard of them, but I didn't know the difference. I didn't know what that meant, and it really becomes a second language that we have to learn and brush up on. And now we become, I like even in the medical profession too, right? Every chemotherapy and drug has the generic name and the brand names. Like, can't we just stick with one? Like, it's already so complicated. So
then when you step forward, they don't want you to have a mastectomy, but because the way my doctor explained, it's already in your bloodstream. What's the use of having a mastectomy? So there's a lot of things that you have to learn, and a lot of things. This medical jargon, stable. What does stable mean?
Right.
It's a lot of stuff, and it just comes at you. But that's why I'm here. I'm here to just continue to advocate for more.
Yeah, and educate all of us. I appreciate that. Lisa, tell us a little bit about your story. I understand that you also had some family history with breast cancer as well.
Yeah, my first introduction to breast cancer was when I was 12, and my grandmother, who I was very close to, decided to show me the top of her scars. And so she had a pretty radical mastectomy in 1971 and was told she had 6 months to live. Literally, she went in for a mole removal and came out without a breast. So that's just the crazy 1970 medical story for you. And she was amazing. She was able to live until she was 95 and die of congestive heart failure, basically of old age instead of breast cancer. My whole family, I'm indeed the fourth generation of my family to have breast cancer, but I'm the first in my family to be diagnosed de novo metastatic. So because of my family history, I had mammograms and ultrasounds actually from the age of 35 and was considered high risk, certainly, but all of my family prior to me they were diagnosed with breast cancer, all early stage breast cancer. And very similar to what Sheila said, or what you said actually, Laura, that you do the chemo, maybe have the mastectomy, have a lumpectomy, and you're good to go and you'll die of old age. And certainly that is the case with my mother, my two aunts who are still living with being early stage breast cancer survivors, and they're doing fine. So everyone in my family was quite shocked with my diagnosis. Part of my story is that it was clearly missed. I kept on going back to my OBGYN twice, actually, in both 2016 and 2017, saying my breast tissue does not feel normal. There was no lump. And I had mammograms and ultrasounds every time, and they kept on coming back, "You're fine." And then finally, in August 2017, my nipple inverted on my right breast. And that was I clearly said, well, I know that's breast cancer. So let's go back again. And we did a biopsy at that point, and so they determined it was breast cancer. And then the MRI, as I was preparing for surgery, was required. And that's what discovered the Mets on my spine. And I was diagnosed in August 2017 with oligometastatic breast cancer, de novo oligometastatic breast cancer. So I only had two to 3 spots on my spine at diagnosis. And certainly that was a shock, and shock for my family, because we've been down this breast cancer road for a long time, but it was always early stage. And again, dismissed as something you could manage. Certainly everyone in my family has been able to manage it. And so for me, that was the beginning of my true education of what breast cancer really was all about.
Can you define those terms for us too? So de novo and
Sure.
the other one, Alona, what was it?
Oligo, yes.
Oligo, okay.
So Sheila and I share a de novo diagnosis, that we are both diagnosed from the beginning at metastatic, that we had metastasized already.
Mm-hmm.
And our cancer was not discovered just when it was in the breast. So when you are a de novo metastatic breast cancer, a person living with metastatic breast cancer, and it was diagnosed de novo, that means that you were diagnosed right at stage 4, from the beginning. Right. Yeah. So there was no training wheels. Not that early stage breast cancer is a walk in the park. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. It's just that you're already stage 4. Yeah. And I think, as Sheila was saying, a lot of times people who are diagnosed at stage 4, the option of surgery is not always there for them. It's more the science has evolved, as we're glad it's evolving, but it's more a systemic approach to your cancer as opposed to let's surgically, not all the time, but a lot of the time. And the other term was oligometastases, and that is that usually it's Sheila, you might be able to help me out. I think it's 7 to 12, 7 under 10, not a lot of Mets.
Oh, okay.
There is a determination. I think it's like up to 7 or something Mets within the body outside of the primary tumor area. And that's what defines you as an oligometastatic case. Now, the reason why that's even important is that there are studies about on individuals who are considered oligometastatic, that perhaps there's different treatments or ways to approach it, and perhaps your outcomes may be extended, but
Sure.
I also know people who've been oligometastatic, and that's, an extended time frame is not necessarily true. As you said, we don't know quite why we have unicorns. We need to find out why, and then replicate that.
Exactly. And, I think even within this huge umbrella of breast cancer, now that we're in it, there are so many subcategories, so many subsets of who and how we're identifying with, and the tribes that we're trying to form, because we want to be supported by people who are going through similar experiences. And so I think when we're talking about de novo metastatic, that in and of itself is an own class, because you're being proactive, as you were mentioning, Lisa, doing these high risk screenings, and even advocating for yourself, saying that something doesn't feel right, but it is so hard, with some of the technology that we have with the mammograms and the ultrasounds. And a lot of times, yes, it is a lump, but then you also have the lobular and other types of characteristics that aren't necessarily showing up on the technology that we're using to screen.
Yeah, it was discovered that I actually have mixed ductal and lobular characteristics to my breast cancer. Mm-hmm. And it was discovered a year and a half after I was initially diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. So the initial biopsy of my tumor did not reveal at that moment that I was a mixed ductal and lobular case. Mm. And why that's interesting is that lobular, of course, is very hard to detect often, because the cells grow in sheets and not in lumps necessarily. And also our friends who have inflammatory breast cancer have the same situation, where sometimes a lump does not form. And then the other piece that's important to note is that if you have dense breast tissue, I tell everybody who will listen to me that if you have dense breast tissue, just please demand an MRI. Because for me, I was told from very early, you have very dense breast tissue, and we really can't see anything. So in my case, probably there's 7 years of really useless microfilm, like,
Sure.
ultrasound and mammography that just really isn't worth the screen it's printed on, because it wasn't going to be detected unless you had an MRI.
Yes,
So
and that
I
is
make sure.
a huge soapbox of mine too, talking about the dense breast tissue, and that your results on your mammogram are only as good as your density, right? And you get these letters in the mail. Not every state even gives you one of those letters to notify you that you have dense tissue. But then, like, when you read down in the small print, it was like, oh, all clear based on this particular type of screening. So, like, really, do we know? So I'm with you there, letting everyone know about that and what that means. And Natalia as well, I also understand, so your story is a little bit different, and you referenced earlier in the conversation about a recurrence. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience with breast cancer?
Sure. So I was diagnosed 3 months after my son was born. So that was in 2017. Yes, that sounds right. So yes, 2017. And I was breastfeeding at the time, and I just noticed a lump. I thought that it had to be a blood duct from breastfeeding. So I did everything that everyone tells you to do to release your ducts, which is like taking warm showers, squeezing them out, make sure you're over breastfeeding, pump, and nothing was going away. So I called my sister, and she just like, get into the doctors, because if you have mastitis, like, it hurts and you'll need to be put on antibiotics and get in them before it gets worse. So luckily, the person I saw is the first time I ever saw this OB, because my OB had just moved out of state. And she was just like, you don't have any of the symptoms for mastitis, so let's just take a look inside and see what's going on. It's probably a blocked duct or something growing, but we shouldn't be too worried. And then it just kind of escalated from there. So I was diagnosed with early stage, about 2B, maybe something more, but they just weren't sure based off of the size of the tumors and how many lymph nodes were affected. So
I'm smiling because that sounds like my story too.
Yeah. So I never know what to say. I just say what my original diagnosis was, but it could have been a later stage, not 4, but stage 3. Anyway, so you go through your year of being on active treatment, so going through chemotherapy and doing the radiation and having the surgeries. And I stopped active treatment in November of 2018. And by January of 2019, I started feeling symptomatic, primarily on my back. So they just did x-rays and a CT without contrast, and they weren't able to find anything. But I thought, I had cancer, so I need to take care of my body now and really think about what to do. So I started seeing other specialists and other doctors for my back. So going through physical therapy, seeing my family practitioner, who then referred me to a spine specialist. And, seeing a specialist, you have to schedule months in advance, unless it's an emergency. So I was just seeing a physical therapist up until I saw the spine specialist, and she ordered CT with contrast, and they had discovered that the breast cancer had metastasized on my spine and several other places, like on my hip. I had a small little one on my rib. So that was in 2019. So since then, I've been through probably 3 different treatments and have had radiation maybe 3 or 4 times in different parts of my body. And then just last winter in November, I had found out that my cancer had metastasized to my brain. So that was just treating that. And then now, so far things are so good. Treatment seems to be working, but yeah, it kind of all just snowballed, really.
Yeah.
It just went from I wish there was a little bit of time before I had progression. I know that sounds weird to say, but it's just from one thing to another. You hear about people progressing maybe years and years after their original diagnosis, but it just kind
I
of
know.
went
I feel like
from,
it's always like year 4, right before they get the benchmark of year 5, or year 9, right before they hit milestone 10, or something like that.
I have a really great team at my oncologist's office, and it's just basically like, if you have any symptoms, let us know what it is. And one of the symptoms was under my chin was starting to get really numb. And like, I just didn't have feeling there. And it could be a plethora of other things. But my nurse practitioner, who I love very much, she was just like, you know what, let's just do a brain MRI. She's like, numbness is a sign that something can be there. And she's like, we know you're stage 4. And unfortunately, my subtypes to FIR were ER positive and HER2 positive when I was originally diagnosed. However, that HER2 was just like barely a HER2. They had to do more sensitive testing to make sure I fell into that category. And when they had biopsied my bones, there wasn't a HER2 positive. So just ER positive. Anyways, yeah, I started feeling numbness on my face, and then some like numbness on one side of my body, on my right hand. And then it started to kind of, I guess, like twitch. And there was some speculation that it could have been a reaction to one certain drug I was taking and some steroids I was on. So they finally did the MRI, and that's when they discovered some tumor and some plaque in my brain.
Oh, well, thank you for sharing that story and the detail, because I think that's, again, people are always asking, like, how did you know? What are the signs and symptoms? And the more that we could share that information, like, we know what to look for. And then also, again, partnering with our medical care team to say, well, I need the peace of mind. Can we please just order this to make sure that, like, I can sleep at night? And from the early stage, like wearing my like early stage breast cancer hat, you know, I feel like every single pain point or anything that is happening, I'm like, oh gosh, it metastasized. Oh gosh, it's like, it's interesting. And I started off this conversation too, like, and I'm just waiting for like it to metastasize, right? Like, I don't know. I think I personally need some of those hope stories as well for the people where they were diagnosed early and it just never comes back, and then something else happens. But, you know, it's constantly this fear of recurrence that is incredibly real. And then I'm sure the fear of progression as well. I would love to like ask, it sounds like, you know, this is and obviously living with metastatic breast cancer is a whole category in and of itself. How has this impacted your relationships with your family, telling your family members, your children, friends and family, etc.?
Okay, well, I mean, I have a story of when I was first diagnosed. So when it was a shock, as I described earlier, and I'm hormone positive. So Natalia, thank you for reminding me to explain. I'm hormone positive and HER2 negative. So for me, it was a shock, and it took me 4 days to tell my husband. I couldn't tell him, and he was with me when I was getting all of these tests done. And then I remember changing from my MRI, and my doctor at the time, my oncologist at the time, asked for a rapid read of the MRI, because I guess she suspected. And so she told me while I was changing as I was getting out of the MRI, and it took me 4 days from that changing room to actually say the words to my husband. So that pretty much sums up my early days in learning to live with this disease. I have quickly gone over to the other side, in that I also agree with you, Laura, that talking about the scary is what brings the light into the room, and doesn't diminish how scary it is or how terrible or hard it can be. But by talking about it, and by being proactive about finding resources for others, helping my family members in making sure that all of them, and yes, they all get MRIs at this point, and my family actually resides in Canada, and so getting MRIs is actually a little bit more challenging. I guess you could argue that. And so all of them instantly got MRIs as a result of my diagnosis. And
Right.
so that's how I've managed it. We talk about it, and I decide to live in metastatic breast cancer land fully and openly. And that's just how I've decided to live.
Yeah. And in these 4 days, would you say that you were just processing the news yourself before you had to actually say it out loud to somebody else? What was going on through your mind at that time?
Yeah, it was a lot of mental jujitsu. It was me preparing myself to devastate another life, not just my own, and the ripple effect of this diagnosis on my family. And so with our children who were in high school and in college at the time, the choice was made. Once I told my husband, there was a choice in telling them I have breast cancer. But as I told you earlier, breast cancer in our family is kind of, it's like today's Friday.
Right.
Mom has breast cancer. We expected it to happen a little earlier than we thought, because I was supposed to get it when I was about 63. That's pretty much on target with the rest of my family.
Yeah.
Post menopause, breast cancer's coming down the pike. And so I was pre-menopause. And so that was a little bit of a surprise, but no big deal. You know, Nana lived till she was whatever, 95. This is going to be fine. But we chose not to tell them the full extent of my disease until after my youngest child had gotten all of his college applications out. We just decided, let's just keep things as simple as possible. I'm deciding or figuring out how I'm doing on this current treatment. Yeah. And then we were able to tell them when a few months after my initial diagnosis. That's how I decided to handle it with my children initially.
That's really helpful too. You know, I think we talk a lot about how do we disclose this information to our children at various ages too, right? Like what are the nuggets that they can bite off, whether they're, 5 and under, if they're like preteens. I know another woman, she was having a really hard time with her daughter because they were talking about, and again, this is in the classroom with like women have long hair and that's what like goes with like the femininity, et cetera. And here's mom who's going and losing all of her hair and going through treatment. And so, for this 7-year-old who's like, isn't trying to understand what is happening, it could be very challenging. And then to your point also, when you're going through the college applications and, the stress of, not wanting to disrupt everyone's life all of a sudden.
I think initially, well, I've been living with it for 11 years.
Congratulations. That's
thank
amazing.
You. It was hard. Because it was the same disease that killed my mom. That stole her from me. And I didn't have time to process it because,
No.
Because I had to be there for everybody else. So I can't break down, because if I break down, everybody else is going to break down. And to tell my dad, he could potentially lose one of his daughters to breast cancer, like he lost his wife, I never had time to process it. You go from being 25 years in the military to, oh, you got stage 4 breast cancer that's in your ribs and liver, to, oh, now you have to retire. Now you have to be on treatment the rest of your life, Then, I only have one daughter, and, I told her, she talking about, well, I'm gonna have a nervous breakdown. I was like, well, you gonna have a nervous breakdown by yourself, because I'm not. I gotta, be strong, and it's,
How old was your daughter at the time?
She was 21. She was in college, University of Toledo, and she wanted to drop out of college. And I said I was not going to let cancer rob her of her future. And then you go from sitting in the room, well, the average is 3 to 5 years, but then you go to 11 years. So we really, don't talk about it now because everybody thinks I'm this strong Black woman. I'm always brave and always strong, and but that's not always the case, you know.
Sure.
So it took me a long time to process it. And then you go on the internet and you read, well, you know, I can remember my best friend, I'm sitting there crying. And she said, well, what's wrong? I said, well, my daughter, I want to see her go to college. And, you know, and she was like, well, how do you know that's not going to happen? She said, quit going on the internet, reading the bad stories, read the good stories of women and men who are living longer with stage 4 breast cancer. And I was like, oh, you got a point. So,
Yeah.
you know, we really don't talk about it. I guess I just want them to not think about it and just let me think about it, you know, because I have 3 sisters, and that's why I do what I do, because I don't ever want them to go through what
Sure.
I always tell them I took one for the team, and I did. I don't ever want them to go through
No.
this, because this is a beast. So it
Yeah. Has your daughter or your sisters done any like genetic testing, or are they getting more high risk screenings because of your diagnosis and your mother's diagnosis?
yes, they did the BRCA and different things like that, but so far, and I pray never that they have to go through this.
I know.
I just pray that it ends with me. You know, then my dad, he worries, and I have to call him like, okay, I got a good scan, you know, make sure that he's happy. So it's like when you have, like I said, when you have metastatic breast cancer, sorry,
No, these are tough conversations.
my nose bleeds because my platelets are low. So that's another thing you have to worry about. Um, I guess I just never, it took me a long time to process it, and I think it's still taking my family, even 11 years later, to process it. That's what I have. But
Well, and like you were saying, it's living with breast cancer, living with metastatic breast cancer. I don't think the processing ever ends because we're going through it. And, you know, on one of our other podcasts, we were talking a lot about grief, and the woman who was speaking and trying to help us understand what grief is, kind of the light bulb went off when she said, you can grieve while you're processing. It doesn't have to happen afterwards. It's not like the event stops and now you can grieve and then the grieving stops. It's like these kind of like these circles that go like smaller and wider and smaller and wider, and just kind of like we don't necessarily know what always is going to trigger us. I remember I'd be on driving to work, sunny, beautiful day, and I'd just start bawling. Like, get to work, mascara is running, I am a wreck, hot flash happening, and I'm like, I can't handle life right now. Like, I just need to take a personal sick day because this is not going well, for no reason, like just out of the blue. And you know, I think our minds are very powerful, and we process things and continue. And Sheila, you know, thank you so much for sharing these. I know these are difficult conversations, but I know that it's helpful for everyone who's listening and watching also to know, like, we resonate with this. It's hard for everybody. I'm curious, you know, as we talk about maybe wanting to be strong for our families and not wanting to share everything that we're going through. I know you mentioned also from like a cultural perspective, like as a Black woman, you don't necessarily talk about having breast cancer as publicly as, you know, some other cultures. I also know like Asian women and other women of color too, just culturally, it's not something we bring up, and either it's a form of weakness or some, you know, all the connotations that can come with that. Does that play a role in how you're feeling with how you're talking or not talking with your daughter and family about your disease?
no, because they need to know. They need to know what type of treatment I'm on. They need to know what chemotherapy I'm on. They need to know all these things. So no, when I have something to say, okay, we about to get in this group chat and I'm about to say it to everybody.
Yeah.
You know, but no, I called my sisters right before treatment and I was like, I just need to cry.
Yeah.
You know, I just need to release. Like today, I went in for my scan and I just started crying. Like, and she was like, what's wrong? And I go to the same nurse because I get scans every 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, what's wrong? She said, oh my God, I can't hug you. I was like, no. I just need a hug.
I
And
know.
she said, I can't hug you. I was like, oh. And it was just nothing wrong. Like you said, I just needed to cry. I don't know why.
Yeah.
But no, I don't,
A release.
I'm not holding back because they need to know, and they need to know how I feel. And they need to know how I feel while I'm on this earth. Don't wait until, that's not to say I'm going anywhere, but don't wait until, I want you to know now today. Bring me my flowers now, like I'm gonna bring you yours.
Yes, I love that. And Natalia, I believe, did you have genetic testing done as well for when you were diagnosed?
Thankfully, the surgeon that I met with, he really pushed for the genetic testing because of my age, even though I didn't have necessarily a family background of cancer. My brother, who's just actually 1 year and 5 days older than I am, so we're basically Irish twins. He died of gastric cancer in 2012, I want to say. So because of that, and my dad has had prostate cancer before, but just super early diagnosis on that. He's like, we don't know if this is genetically in your genes, but it's like, it might not be a bad idea. So I got the genetic testing done, and it came through as negative, that there's nothing leading. No, well, it came out, there's some variances that maybe weren't, couldn't confirm whether I was BRCA positive, but so we were just going with the negative standpoint. But after I became metastatic, I got my current doctor really encouraged me to get a second opinion. He's just like, we just need more eyes on this, and we're not a research hospital. It might be a good idea for you to go to a research hospital and get a second opinion. And as I was kind of going through getting that second opinion, the oncologist I was seeing saw that there was a variance, and she's like, I would love to have my research, my genetic researchers kind of take a look at this, because maybe something will come up. So she did, and they said that this variance was very similar to other variances that there were, I don't know how to explain it, but that could be BRCA positive. And so she's like, that is good to know, because in the future we can use other sorts of treatment because of it's so similar to being BRCA positive.
Okay.
And then 6 months after that, I got a call from my genetic counselors the lab that I originally did my testing at, that confirmed that it was reclassified, that this variant is now a BRCA2 positive variant. So, and a long story, yes. So I did genetic testing. I'm a huge advocate for it because, especially with the Latinx community, I think I was reading recently that they have the most variety of genetic pool than anywhere else in the world are in Latin American countries.
Wow.
And there's so many, just learning this myself, environmental factors that kind of cause cancer, that can kind of emphasize those genetics into becoming more vulnerable to cancers. So after I found out, then my sister also found out that she was BRCA positive recently. And so there's an assumption that maybe my brother was also, who passed away, was BRCA positive, but he wasn't offered, and he didn't get the genetic testing at the time. So there's no way. I guess we could test his son, but there's all sorts of complications involved with even having that information, and maybe waiting until they're much older. But yeah,
absolutely. I know. I did a presentation not too long ago on the ethics of genetic testing. I'm a big proponent of it as well, but there's also so many, ethical decisions to make, especially when you're talking about family members who may not want to know the information. And don't even get me started on like life insurance and all the other issues and BS that we have to fight. But
it's good to know that it is in our history now, just because like I have a daughter and a son, but that they can be, they can be looked after, and maybe find early interventions if they need to avoid getting cancer.
Well, thank you. And if we wanted to switch gears a little bit, I would love to hear how you guys all got connected and the birth of our MBC Life, which is the podcast you guys are spearheading and really giving space and voice to the metastatic community.
I guess I'll start, but I have to say that our MBC Life is a podcast that is a team sport. And I love the language that Sheila uses at times that evokes this, I'm taking one for the whole team. We are a team. So it started where I was diagnosed in 2017, quickly in early 2018, when I sort of had my legs underneath me at that point. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that was fundraising just for metastatic breast cancer research. So I quickly understood that that's something that I needed to focus on, that it was an area that needed attention. And from there, I was introduced through a support group from my treatment research cancer center where I get treated here in New York City. I met a bunch of people, just that support group is just a powerhouse of advocates. And so I quickly was schooled by these incredible women. And then from there, I was introduced to Share Cancer Support and because I'm a clinical therapist, at least that's one of my careers that I've had in my life. As a clinical therapist, I thought, you know what, I can utilize some of my skills to lead support groups, and so I did that. I also started leading webinars on issues related to the metastatic breast cancer community for Share Cancer Support. Quickly from there, I felt like those webinars were great and all. But they're one and done. And yeah, they live sometimes on YouTube, but not all the time. And so I felt like these are really important conversations. The metastatic breast cancer community needs those conversations to be more widely available. And so I started talking to the people at Share about different ways to do that, and made the proposal at the end of 2019 that I think a podcast would be a good idea. And I think you and I've talked about this. There's a low barrier to entry to podcasting, but there is a high barrier, at least I would say, to a good podcast. And so it requires a lot of effort. But again, I made the proposal. They were saying, you know what, we don't think that's a good idea, Lisa. I mean, it was a fine idea, Lisa, but maybe not now. Well, the pandemic hit. And then clearly there was a realignment of how are we going to service the metastatic breast cancer community in an effective way when we can't have in-person conferences and so forth. And then they literally just said, I know we said it didn't sound like a good thing now, but now we think it's a great idea. Mm-hmm. And so quickly on a dime, I was able to just have a small little team of people that thought that this idea was a good one. And from there, we started figuring out how are we going to build this. So for me, the key thing was that everyone on the team should be living with metastatic breast cancer, that it really was for us, by us, and it was for our stories, the way we want to tell them, the priorities that are important to us, and that we would bring in experts and people who are advocating for us who don't necessarily have metastatic breast cancer, certainly, but that our team that works on the podcast we would all be living with this disease. And that was really important to me. In addition, I really wanted it to not be the Lisa Laudico podcast, because that would be boring. And I also felt like it needed to be focused on everyone's and the diverse stories out there. And so I wanted a team to join me in this little journey, or whatever we want to call it, this little project. And so from this small team of people, we started figuring out and connecting. And so, of course, as you noted, Sheila McGlown is well known in our community. And so we were really lucky that Sheila decided to join our team. And I have to mention our amazing team member, Shantae Randall, and she with Sheila, I think between Sheila, Shantae, and Victoria Goldberg, who's one of our lead producers, and now she's a host of her own segment on the pod. All three of those incredible women were able to connect us to even more people right, within the community. And that's how I got to meet Natalia. Shantae introduced me to Natalia. And so we are all about that. We are open to any listener to this podcast. If you're interested in you're living with metastatic breast cancer, or interested in any aspect of podcasting or in telling stories, writing for our blog, the table is big and wide and huge. And we have I like to think we have a good time doing what we do. One of my things is I really want the podcast to serve our community. I want it to be as well done as we possibly can. And I want it to be fun for the people that are involved in it.
I'd say as we close through this, actually I have a couple more questions to wrap things up, but what advice do you have for those listening? I would say whether we want to take it from the angle of early stagers or caregivers or people who are not living with MBC, what could we be doing to support the MBC community?
I think, you're right, there is a laundry list of things that we could be doing in the MBC community. I think one of it is being able to, especially in the early stage breast cancer community, is being open to talking about MBC and reoccurrences. I know that it's kind of a downer when once you go through your treatment, you want to feel like it's done and that you don't have to repeat that part again. But statistics tell us that if you're an early stage breast cancer survivor, you have a 30% chance of having a reoccurrence. And that's a big number. Most people who are stage 4 had early stage breast cancer. So in 2018, there was quite the debate whether we should be sharing those statistics about how many people die of metastatic breast cancer and how often a recurrence happens on social. I don't know if any of you or all of you were around during that time, but I think it got kind of heated about it. And I just thought, it's such a weird conversation. The conversation is whether we should have a conversation that includes me or doesn't include me. And that's how I felt about it at the time. So I think that being open to talking about it in early stage breast cancer, that it's not just about surviving that 1 year of active treatment, but it's about maybe potentially living with
kind of the rest of your life. Yeah, exactly. No, that's exactly how I feel. I just quote unquote celebrated what I call my cancerversary April 7th, and that was the day that was my surgery date. So that's the date that like I chose to, like, they came in, they scooped out the cancer, et cetera. But then in the bottom of that blog post, I kind of listed, you know, all of the other things that I've learned about like loss and the mental side of what happens after that diagnosis, things that I would have never believed if my oncologist told me, Laura, yes, I know this is going to be life-changing news for you, but like, do you really know what life-changing means? Like, I probably wouldn't have believed him, right? Because you can't really fathom how disruptive that it is until you're going through it, really. Thank you for sharing that. I think
the second thing really quick would be just to not look at MBCers or people who have MBC as people who are done living.
No.
I think there's so many more people living with MBC than we realize that just they're not sharing the information. Just because, I mean, having MBC is also a full-time job, but they're not maybe as forthcoming as sharing their life with having metastatic breast cancer. And so when some of us pop up here and there, it's like, oh, you know, these are stage 4 people, that there aren't so many of them, but it's nice to see that they're around. But that's not the case. There's so many people living with metastatic breast cancer, and that a lot of us are not at the end of our lives, you know, or seemingly it doesn't seem like that. We really don't get to the end of it until, you know, progression usually happens quick. So we never know when that's going to happen. And until then, we're all just living the same lives as everyone else. And I feel like there's this sense of that we just want to mourn and feel bad for people who have MBC. And I don't think most people who have metastatic breast cancer, it's in their wheelhouse to do that all the time, because they're honestly, just like me, like right after this podcast, I got to go deal with 2 little kids, that we're all just like living
life
our
continues, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop, just like it didn't when you had for early diagnosis,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
What I've learned as a person living with this disease, that I love that what Natalia was saying about quality of life as well. And I think Sheila also spoke to it so well, that for an early stager, it is very anxiety provoking, and we totally understand that. I completely get it. Even though I was never with an early stage diagnosis myself, I've many family members who've lived through that, are living through that. And so what I've found is that as the research is changing, and as you correctly pointed out, there is more emphasis, thank goodness, on metastatic breast cancer research. Inevitably, the research that's helping our quality of life, finding treatments that extend our lives and hopefully will lead to a cure, will inevitably improve the lives of those who've had an early stage diagnosis. So by being informed, as informed as possible, will help you recognize earlier, pieces of health that of your health case that will improve your medical care, whether you metastasize or not. And in fact, if you have, I was on, when I was first diagnosed, I was on Ibrance, and that drug is actually being used for early stage patients now. And so that's just one example of how systemic treatments can in fact filter into the early stage community. And I think that's really important. So by knowing and understanding the metastatic breast cancer world, it's not scary. It's like, be informed, because it's going to help your life. And that's not just, it's going to help your life if you become metastatic. No. It's going to help your life now as a person who's gone through an early stage diagnosis and is continuing on, doing that, monitoring of themselves. So there's something in it for the early stage community, if you can put it that way. But I would say that I loved what Natalia said. And so that'll be your mic drop, that we're living fully. And yes, we are living fully and trying to live with this disease and have our quality of life as good as it possibly can, as long as it possibly can.
Well, thank you. And Sheila, do you have anything that we haven't talked about yet that you would like to add?
I just think it's all about delivery. MBC patients are seen as angry, and they want to tell early stagers how to live their life. If they're not ready to process it, they're not ready to process it. So don't force it on them. At some time they may be, but I can remember times where I really don't belong to Facebook groups, because the women on there are so angry. I don't expect you to be like me. Like, I'm angry too. I'm angry at cancer. I'm angry I got it. I'm angry. But I've just chosen to use that anger to help others to use it in a positive manner. It's all about the delivery. Hey, well, maybe let's just have this little conversation about the recurrence rate is this. Have you talked to your doctor about it first?
Mm-hmm.
What have they told you about it reoccurring or whatever? Or it's, some people aren't ready. Black women not gonna talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they want to forget it, leave it behind, and move on. And that's okay. But that's your life. Don't push it on me.
Right.
And as far as, we don't know how many people, because SEER, that's a whole nother story.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't know how many people are dying from medicine, because the records aren't accurate. And
or who's living with it better. I think that's like a big thing, is like, who's living their best life with cancer. And it's like,
no,
why does it have to be like that?
And they said, well, you have her too, you're gonna live long. Well, what do you mean? It's people, my mom, I don't, to this day, I still don't know what subtype my mom had, but there are people with HER2 positive breast cancer that have passed away in 2 or 3 years. Who's to say? Like
I was a vegan before my diagnosis, and I love people telling me, oh, you should go plant-based. I'm like, guys, vegans get breast cancer too. Like, just
I ain't going on plant-based.
Right.
I'm sorry, I'm greedy. Look at us.
Right.
But it's
marathoners get metastatic breast cancer.
Yeah. That's why I love this conversation today. I'm truly honored to be, quote unquote, the early stager and talking with my friends in the MBC world about how we can come together and share experiences that are they're shared experiences. Like, you hear these words, we're dealing with it, we're trying to manage quality of life. And hopefully by having this conversation, we are able to kind of break down some of the tensions between early stage and late stage, and we can really move together proactively for change and research and education. So for that, I really appreciate it.